Welcome to The Bottom Half is Red. This is executive producer Dave Tandrup. This episode was originally intended to be a single show, but it was such a great and fun conversation that it lasted for over an hour. Generally, we try to keep the episodes around 25 minutes, and I didn't want you to miss anything that would normally be lost during the editing process. So we split it up into 3 amazing shows. You're going to hear the first one today and the rest over the next 2 weeks. I hope that you enjoy these episodes of The Bottom Half's Red.
Hey guys, welcome to The Bottom Half is Red. I'm your host, Barron Longstrath, and I am excited to bring to you a show that is going to give you some thought-provoking discussions. It's going to give you some expert insights to both encourage and some practical steps for how to build an organization that can more effectively introduce the world to Jesus Christ. So what is The Bottom Half is Red? It's all about building a culture of excellence. It's about growing your unique and creative identity. And it's about carrying out the will of God at any cost. So you're going to see that through practical teaching tips, developing a culture of giving, creating branding and marketing, or even methods to help guests feel safe and welcomed. This podcast is going to have you covered. But before we dive into today's episode, I want to take just a moment and extend a special invitation to all of our dedicated listeners. If you're looking to get even more involved in our community and gain some access to some behind-the-scenes stuff, become a Patreon supporter. And you can find that link in the episode description or even on Patreon. Just visit The Bottom Half is Red. Listen, we can't wait to welcome you on board and to share this exciting journey. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Well, welcome back to The Bottom Half is Red. I hope you've enjoyed the Season 2 episodes so far. We really have enjoyed bringing these to you. And Season 2 has just been a little bit different, and I've kind of enjoyed the difference of it. We're a little bit more sporadic in Season 2, and probably a lot of that has to do with the fact that when Dave and I talked about towards the close of Season 1, we decided that we wanted to bring various subjects to the table that would inform, entertain, and this is one that I think is going to do both of those, and I'm excited about it. You're going to like this episode, especially if you consider yourself a reader. And if that's the case, sit back, grab a cup of coffee, because you're really going to enjoy it. So who is in the studio today? Our very own David Tandrup, executive producer, and our very own Rustin Young, who is a critical part of the staff here at the church today. And he is an executor, him and his wife. Without them, we would be up a creek without a paddle. What is the episode about? It is about reading. It's about books. It's an opportunity for us to sit down at a table, and this is going to be a conversation. And so what we're going to do today is we're just going to fire off. We don't have any notes in front of us, so I'm feeling the freedom of that. I think Dave's probably I don't know.
Dave's got notes.
Okay. It's not fair. He's the only one with a computer at the table. Russ and I are sitting here just, enjoying the fact that we're going to have liberty.
We've been around the block a little bit.
We've been around the block. Dave?
Not the first rodeo.
Not the first one.
Dave's going to help guide this. But what this is going to look like today is just a conversation between 3 avid readers. And we have various book subjects that we're going to talk about, genres, maybe that's a better way to put it. And we're going to bring to the table things that really have impacted us, why it impacts us. Through that, I can gather that we're going to look into what reading means to us, why we read, maybe various points in which we read. But we do have books, lots of books in the office, some books sitting here on the table. And so what we're going to do is we're going to turn it over right now to Dave Tandrup, and he is going to help guide us through the process. Appreciate you being with us. Dave, take over.
All right. So the genres of books that we are going to be speaking about today is we each have 3 books. One of the books are nonfiction, one book is fiction, and then the third book is going to be on leadership. And so we'll go through the nonfiction. Each one of us will present our books, talk about it, have a couple questions, cross-table conversation about it, and then once that's expired, we'll move on to the fiction and then the leadership. Barron, what is your nonfiction book?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult for us all because we have to only bring one.
Yeah.
So I was sitting on the airplane on the way back from Seattle and trying to think, man, what one book would I like to bring to our audience just in each category? So nonfiction-wise, I chose The Insanity of God. And the writer uses a pseudonym. Is that how you say that?
Pseudonym.
Yep, that's it right there. And he is identified as Nick Ripken. If you haven't read the book, you need to pick it up because it's a life-changing book.
I guess one of the questions that I would have is, what's some of the key takeaways that you got from The Insanity of God?
Okay, so obviously it would be within the perimeters of kind of a Christian genre of a book. So, but The Insanity of God, the title kind of explains exactly the direction he's going. And he's not talking about that God is insane, but what he is talking about is the calling. So the calling that God oftentimes brings us to can appear insane. And so I wrote down a couple notes here. I won't go into all the detail of it because we had a lot to talk about today. But some of the takeaways for me is how I appreciate the way that Ripken normalizes what we would say would be the absurdity, even to the point of insanity, of God's ways. Okay, he demonstrates some of these hellacious experiences of the call towards following him. And a lot of books that we read nowadays are talking about how that we can deal with the struggles of that God calling or being a Christian or serving God, or even how to overcome that. Ripken's point is not necessarily to try to get us through. He's not trying to get us through to say, hey, here's how you cope with that. He's simply saying there's a part of Christianity, especially outside of the realms of first world countries, that you have to learn how to deal with the ways of being underground or persecuted or always on the move. And so what this book helped me with is that our faith, no matter what degree, is worth it.
Yeah.
And I think that there are different degrees of persecution. Obviously, I'm not in prison. Obviously, I'm not getting persecuted by a government. I'm not in hiding. We worship openly on a Sunday and a Wednesday, and whenever we want to. I listen to my Christian music as loud as I want to in my vehicle, if that were the case, which rarely ever happens, but it would be fine. My apps aren't limited on my phone. I have access to all that. But there is a degree of, there's a degree of it. It might be light, but there's a degree of being whatever, persecuted for his name, or at least being looked at because you have this type of faith. But he shows and reveals that no matter what degree of persecution, it's worth it. I love The Insanity of God. In fact, I would encourage any Christian out there, even if you don't feel called to ministry, it's not a ministry book. I mean, he talks about ministry. It's not a ministry book. It is a Christian book. If you're a Christian, read it. I mean, it's gonna light your faith up and reassure you that, hey, this is worth living out, and this is worth surrendering to the calling of God to go into all the world.
It's very clearly had an impact on how you view Christianity, but what are some of the practical applications that you take away from it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One of the things that I would say is the perspective of a first world believer is how important it is for us to to look at these nations and say, I may not step foot in that, okay, but I can push myself there through prayer. I can pray specifically for what we would call access challenged nations.
Yeah.
I could pray that God sends laborers into the field. I can strengthen my faith practically by saying, okay, what is it that I truly believe? Okay, I can look at his kingdom and say, okay, it's worth every investment. So how much time do I spend? For instance, I've been sitting down with my middle son, and we've been looking into the difference between our faith and other faiths, okay? What we believe versus what other people believe. And this book really kind of presses you into understanding how important it is to know what you believe in order to be able to say, listen, I got to go out and I got to change my world.
Yeah.
I mean, can I reach? I mean, we've been talking neighbors matter, whatever. How willing am I to go into all the world and to preach the gospel? Can I even go to my local coffee shop? We got 2 Starbucks on the table. Can I go to Starbucks and open my Bible and be willing to say, I'll share my faith to anybody that wants to, you know what I'm saying? Like, so practically, like, yeah, it gives the concept of what goes on overseas, but man, how am I actively engaged, even where I'm at in a non-persecuted country?
I think particularly as Americans, we have a tendency to look at like foreign missions as that's something exotic.
Yeah.
But we have to remember the fact that wherever it is, whether it's Somalia, China, Denmark, that is somebody's home. So that is home to them. And so there's not a real big difference between us going there and doing it and us doing it in our home.
That's a great point. One of the points that one of the stories that he tells is his initial calling. He sits before his board, whatever the organization is. He sits before that board, and they're literally asking him and his wife at the very beginning of their travels, and I think they spent 30 years overseas and interviewing in 70-something different nations. And so a lot of those nations are access-challenged nations. And he sits down with these persecuted Christians, and it's an amazing story. But when he sits down before his board initially, they ask him to explain his calling. And they're thinking it's going to be some divine revelation. I was in prayer. And he literally sits down and he says, the Bible says to go ye into all the world.
Yep.
And they yeah, okay, we know that, but tell us what. And he said, no, I'm telling you, the Bible says to go ye into all the world. Well, tell us why you feel drawn to this nation. Well, because the Bible says to go ye into all the world.
Yeah, basically, there's a need and I can help.
That's exactly what he's saying. He's not saying there's a divine whatever. He's simply saying the word is divine and I'm responding to that word, and there's a need there and we're going there.
That's amazing.
No, I'm going to tell you, if you want to be messed up, you will sit down and you will cry in one moment and you will rejoice in the next. These aren't boring stories. This will keep you on. This is a thriller. It'll keep you on the edge of your seats. If you've never read The Insanity of God, it's quite a story.
Rustin, what did you bring for nonfiction?
All right. So this book was actually recommended to me by an instructor when I was at Bible college. But essentially, this is a book that is called What We Can't Not Know.
I like it.
By J. Buchachevsky. Listeners, don't try to spell it because it'll be wrong.
I'm looking at its name. It would be wrong.
Oh, yeah. You don't even know how to pronounce it. I've heard it before. But a book called What We Can't Not Know by J. Buchachevsky. And it's a philosophy book at its core, a philosophical book. But what he's dealing with is the concept of natural law and natural morals that are intrinsic in reality, in the created order. He's going up against, I would say, the postmodern philosophical notion of the, let's say, resistance against the concept of a meta-narrative, a grand narrative, an overarching story that makes sense of reality. The claims that there is no absolute truth, that morals are just socially constructed. They're things that we make up, and another culture may have different morals than we do, and they're not wrong and we're not wrong. He essentially says there are things that are intrinsic there are moral realities that are intrinsic in human beings that we all know, no matter where you're from, where you've been born. But we all know this. Are they socially reinforced? Yes. But there are certain things that everyone knows and cannot not know.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what would be some of the examples of things that we cannot not know?
So, for example, no matter where you go, murder is never looked at as a good thing. Nowhere. Now, there are people that commit murder, of course, but they know that what they're doing is wrong, even though they may not feel like it. He even goes down to, tribes that are what we consider not civilized, killing people that are not a part of their tribe. Well, the fact that there's a tribe shows that there's some sort of community right there where a moral code is reinforced. They might just not view people outside of their tribe as human or as human as they are. But in order for them to work, there has to be a moral code. And so one claim that he makes in this book is that no matter where you go, no matter where you look in history, any society that has existed has had codes that more or less mirror the 10 Commandments that were given in the Bible, which shows us that these things didn't just materialize as soon as the pen met the parchment, the chisel met the stone. These things are ingrained in all of us, right? They're just revealed to us more clearly, and they're put a face to it, a person behind it in Scripture. He gives one example. In no society is it ever looked at as virtuous to lie about something or to steal. People steal, people lie, but no one appreciates being stolen from. No one appreciates being lied to. And in fact, a lot of times when people, have something stolen from them, they're quick to assert that that is wrong. That's an immediate appeal to a higher standard, which in turn suggests a grand narrative, an overarching story, an overarching authority that governs all of reality. And he even says, even babies more or less are aware that certain things are wrong, even though they can't even comprehend concepts. For example, you have to teach a baby to share. You don't have to teach it to take things that isn't theirs, right? You have to teach, we would say that's the sinful nature of human beings, right? You have to teach them to share, not to steal, but you don't have to teach a baby to cry whenever you take something away from it. Why is that, right? It's like it's ingrained in all of us at a nature level, these things. And so essentially he clarifies, and it's a restatement really of C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And so if you haven't read that, I'd recommend that as well. But yeah, he breaks down each commandment of the 10 Commandments, and he asserts that behind each commandment, behind each precept of the law, what we would call the Old Testament law, there is a principle that is guiding that precept. And behind the principle is a reflection of a person, and we would call that person God.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
after you read that, what was the impact of that book on your life? How did that book's information change the way that you looked at things?
First of all, I started to take very much more seriously the words that are written in the Old Testament. I took them seriously to begin with, but to the first-time reader, they might just be like a list of laws and stories with no obvious object of what is the central meaning here. But as soon as you understand that there are things that are revealed about God in the Old Testament just by the laws and the ways that he interacts with mankind, it brings clarity just to who God is and what his objective goal is for humanity. So for example, thou shalt not kill, right? I mean, the Hebrew word, I don't know what it doesn't come to mind right now, but the word means to murder, the unlawful taking of a life. It's considered the most desecrating thing you could do to the image of God, right? Harming someone that is in his image. So thou shalt not kill, murder. Well, first of all, that asserts that every human being has value.
Yeah.
Right? Even people that are different than you, They are not more or less valuable. We are all ingrained with value. And I think that points back to the creation story where it says, and God made man in his own image. It points to the value, but it also gives us kind of a special place in the economy of God. He says he values you to a certain point that separates us from the animals, right? You know, killing a person is not the same thing as killing an animal, right? It elevates man to a certain position when it comes to God. And so one of the principles that is behind that is we have intrinsic value, and life is good and worth preserving, right? It is to be respected. And behind that principle is a person, God. He is the giver of life. He breathed life into us. He made a living being for a reason and a purpose. And so it just trains you a little bit to think a little deeper about the precepts of God, the rules and regulations. You think to yourself, what are these revealing? These came from God. What are these revealing about the character of God, right? And how does that inform my New Testament theology?
It lends a lot of credence into, particularly in Genesis. Genesis talks about, then men begin to call on the name of God. Well, the 10 Commandments had not been codified yet. And so how did people know to serve God? You've got Melchizedek, that was the high priest of God.
Right.
How did you have all of this stuff with Abraham? How did they have a relationship if there was not a knowledge, like an inherent knowledge of, you called it these meta rules,
right,
that just went deeper than our particular culture?
Right.
Yeah,
they just knew.
Yeah.
They knew, right? The Bible words it in kind of a poetic way. It was written on their hearts, right? But essentially what that means is God created us with ingrained morals that were designed to be socially reinforced because we're designed to be communal beings, right? We're not designed to be isolated or individualist, right? And so I would say that book, it was hard to put down, but also it's one that you really want to digest. You really don't want to blaze through it. You want to take your time, soak in the chapters. I've gone back several times, whether I'm getting material for a lesson or whether or not I just want to go back and clarify something, what is the reason for this? I guess it lets you know that God does everything for a reason.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that mine is going to bring as much educational value to the table. My nonfiction book is called The Night Stalkers, and it's by Michael Durant. And Michael Durant, most people are probably familiar with the movie Black Hawk Down and the book that it's based off of. Well, Night Stalkers is a firsthand account of the 160th Aviation Regiment, and it tells a lot of stories and experiences of how they go about doing business. It gives a great perspective on like their intense training, the high stakes missions, stuff like that. In fact, like one of my absolute favorite things is the U.S. was trying to protect like oil trade routes from Iran, and Iran was just being a menace along the straits. And this Iranian gunboat was coming up, and there were these 3 Little Bird, they're tiny little helicopters, and they were gunships. And that was literally the only armament that was there to protect it. And these helicopters are vastly outmatched against this Iranian gunship. But basically what they did was they played these bumblebee tactics where one would fly in as a bait to draw the guns of this gunboat to turn around and lock on. And right before it would lock on, this helicopter would dive away. Meanwhile, there would be 2 others that would be moving in from a different angle, doing strafing runs. And so they're hitting it from all kinds of different compass points. And it's just an incredible story of like on the fly coordination, hitting it with like machine guns and rockets that they didn't have the equipment to take it down just straight out. And so they had to use like ingenuity and the resources that was there to take on a superior foe. And so I just loved the book. It was a fantastic book. I read it before joining the Army, and it was one of the inspirations that made me want to become a helicopter pilot, because I was like, wow, these guys are busy talking, communicating, thinking on the fly, and they've got an incredibly dangerous situation. and they're able to execute this.
Yeah, I mean, it honestly shows like team collaboration.
Yeah,
things that we've talked about even behind the microphones when they weren't on, sitting at this table, about things that, you know, I'll call them missions or whatever, however you would say that, coordination and things of that nature. It shows, like when you were talking, I'm like, oh yeah, this is Dave right
in
here.
His element
This is Dave in his element right now. But he loves, like, if you don't know Dave, he loves that sense of like, oh, how would I say it? I don't know if I want to say perfection, but complete order, even in the midst of chaos. Like, you like that. You like a sense of order and chaos. So
I like to have a plan.
Yeah, the plan. And so when you're telling me about diving in and diving out, I guess telling our audience, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see why Dave is just so into. And I mean, when was the book written?
It was released in 2007.
Oh, okay. So what was the missions? 2000, or was it before, in the 90s?
So they would have occurred probably in the early 2000s into the 90s. It even details like back into the 80s. So the origin of the 160th, which is the unit that we're talking about. And so the 160th, their job is to fly all of the special operations missions. So you've got the Green Beret, Delta Force, Navy SEALs. Generally speaking, if they're flying on a helicopter, it's the 160th. That's who flies them. And they fly almost exclusively at night, which is the most difficult mode of flight to be flying in. But they were formed because of the failed rescue for the hostages at the embassy in Iran back in the 80s. And it came out of that debacle that there just was not a special forces capable aviation unit to be able to do this stuff. And so they created one. And there's some wild cowboy stuff that went on, and it's fantastic. It talks about like how they started working with industry. Like, they didn't have helicopters that did what they needed them to do. And so it would literally be like a guy with this little helicopter welding a 55-gallon drum onto the side of the aircraft so that you could have like Navy SEALs sitting on the 55-gallon drum, because nobody made a helicopter to do that. And so it was literally cutting edge, and sometimes it would be a little scary about like the stuff that they did. But
I'm reading about it, like Dave's talking, I'm reading about it. And so I thought when you gave the title of the book, I thought it was probably written more toward an operational name.
Yeah.
You know, what would you call that? Like, what is the operations name? Like
a mission and operation.
Yes, exactly.
A code name.
Correct. And it's not. This is actually
No, that's their unit name. Is the Night Stalkers.
That's sick. The officer course lasts 20 to 28 weeks.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm reading all of it. It's incredibly interesting what these men are required to accomplish. Yeah, Dave, you had me at the Night Stalkers.
Yep.
Okay. Not at Hello, but at the Night Stalkers. That's when you had me. That's cool. I had no idea about it.
It says right here that their motto is "Death waits in the dark."
It does.
With an exclamation point.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us on The Bottom Half is Red. Listen, I hope you have enjoyed your time with us today and gained something of value. If you love what you heard today, please do not forget to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. This helps us. Your feedback is incredibly crucial, and we want to improve on what we're doing and to bring you the best content possible. You can find us on Facebook, look us up, Instagram, even YouTube at The Bottom Half is Red. Hey, be sure to check the episode description for any links to any resources that we have mentioned during the show. You don't want to miss out. This podcast is a production of The Church Today here in the great city of Tulsa, and the executive producer is our very own David Tandera. I hope you've had a fantastic time, and we look forward to having you with us again on our next episode of The Bottom Half is Red. We'll see you then.